It is 5 o'clock somewhere, and you've tuned into Season 3, Episode 3 of BRC. For those of you who'd like to watch this episode, I highly recommend it. You can view Season 3 on our website, YouTube, Spotify, whiskeynetwork.net, and Zencaster. I'm Carrie Moynihan, and in today's Reading on the Rocks, I speak with author Becky Garrison about her new book, Distilled in Washington. Kick off your shoes, pour yourself a dram, and join me for this episode of Barrel Room Chronicles. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is that you are catching the show today. Today on the show, we have author Becky Garrison, author of Distilled in Washington, a fascinating historical book about how distilling became to be in Washington state. Becky, with no further ado, I'd love to talk to you about your book. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. Much appreciated.
Oh, it's great to have you. I've been reading your book for the last week or so, and I'm finding it very interesting. There's a lot of great information in here, and I can't wait to get into the nitty-gritty with you on this book. First of all, let's. What I always talk to people about when we get on the show is your whiskey journey. So give me a little background about when you were a wee little lass. Did you ever think that you would be interested in whiskey or writing books about whiskey?
No, given my family's history of alcoholism and the fact they would consume Southern comfort and not the good stuff, I never ever thought I would be writing on this subject. But then I moved to the Pacific Northwest, where I began to learn about terms like regenerative agriculture, began to hear conversations about terroir around whiskey, similar that you keep hearing about wine. And this rekindled a love that I had begun in the 1990s when I discovered cigars, fly fishing, and Lagavulin, to be precise. I got into that whole cigar and scotch movement in the 1990s. I kind of abandoned it for a while. I just figured this is just a little bit of a hipster movement that I shouldn't, kind of like, this is a little bit too trendy. I just don't feel quite right. And then when I moved back to the Pacific Northwest, I picked up the whiskey again with a definite Pacific Northwest twist to it.
That's fantastic. So how long have you been back up in that area?
I moved here in 2014.
Okay, so a good 10 years.
Yeah.
All right, so tell me, when you got back into it in 2014, how did that interest getting back into the spirit fire your interest in writing this this book?
Well, I was in Seattle, interviewing. One of my beats was religious. I was covering this nefarious preacher who was kind of notorious in Seattle, and I connected with Charles Finkel, who is this legendary beer and wine pioneer in Seattle with Pike's Pub. He introduced me to Jason Parker, who was his first head brewer over at Copperworks. And from there, he said, you got to try Jason's stuff. So I began to discover that with Jason, I was getting a beer-informed whiskey where they are brewing their wort, not distilling it, and adds a very strong flavor. I'm like, wow, this is incredible whiskey. Then you try Westward, which had the similar sensibility in Oregon. People don't realize Westward is the largest brewery, or one of the largest breweries in Portland, because they too also brew their wort. And from there I met Westland, who they don't brew their wort, but their approach is so unique to the way they take their barley program, their oat program. And every whiskey distillery I walked into had a very unique and distinctive story. And that just became, these stories are just so fascinating. And then it hit me as I started learning where I read about these stories where they don't exist. No one has written a book. They've written books about the history of drinking in America, where you discover how drunk we were at the turn of the century. Holy God. I mean, but, and there's been, Mark Forsythe did the whole global history of drunkenness, but no one has ever really sat down and said, well, how did this glass of whiskey, what started the whiskey's journey to the West, and where did it end up to going from being this absolutely god-awful, horrible product that you only drank because you had no other options, to a award-winning craft where Westland just got nominated the best whiskey in the world. So how did that journey happen? And the reason I'm emphasizing whiskey is whiskey really became the dominant spirit that won the West. I mean, no question about it.
I love it. So when did you start? Okay, so you moved back in 2014. When did you start working on this book?
I sold the book, I believe, in November of 2022, and it was turned in December 2023. The final proofing. So basically, the book was written in about 8 months, and then it's the copy editing, the proofing, and making sure you got all the dice all the dots are done and everything's to go.
Yeah. So tell me, what was the most interesting thing that you learned while researching for this book?
How few distilleries there were. I mean, the fact that until Dry Fly came along, I could count on one hand the number of distilleries that actually lasted more than a year or two. It was just phenomenal, fascinating to me that, I mean, I guess when you start looking at the dates, the Washington became a state till 1889, and Prohibition was 1920. You can see we're still a lot of that rebel culture there, and just the extent to which also that whiskey played from the very beginning, from the fur traders using it to trade to the
Fur
laws
traders. I
regulating.
wore this in honor of the fur
Yes,
traders today.
and you realize from the very beginning this was a form of commerce. This was how they traded. You don't realize that when until something becomes a state, how little is out there.
Yeah.
And just looking at also just how rough and tumble this was. I mean, you go to Seattle and you think this is so sophisticated, and you don't realize that how the term Skid Row came about is because they were skidding loads down Yesler Avenue. The loggers were, and the people that were going to this bar right where they were when they weren't skidding the logs were not exactly the kind of people you really wanted to associate with. So you begin to realize all these terms that we use, like Skid Row, and the how much originated from this particular culture.
That's crazy. So, I was reading the beginning here, and you have a lot of really interesting facts.
Mhm.
Um, and we start off in the introduction. We talk about the pilgrims, and I love the picture here in the beginning where the father is shoveling beer down his daughter's throat. That's fantastic. Um, and then you've got a bunch of some really good drawings that I love in here too for those watching at home. Um, so there's so many things I want to ask you. So let's talk about the origins of distilling on the Oregon Trail. Like, how did you find out about that? And I know that one of the things that I recognized in the book here was that a lot of the saloons back in the early days were tents. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about that and how they weren't really big structures, etc.
Well, a lot of these were kind of compiling a bunch of different books. Mark Forsythe's book, The History of Drunkenness, Susan Cheever's Drinking in America. A.R. Rohrbach did a book called The Alcoholic Republic. There's another book called Saloons and Scoundrels. And from all these books, you kind of get little bits and pieces. And from there, I learned that when Lewis and Clark went out, they never list whiskey in a list of the settler's guide. You kind of read this up. Okay, what do you need to have? They didn't include whiskey. I mean, the only drink they included was coffee. So you start to kind of get, okay, why didn't they include whiskey? Why did they not want to mention that? Because then one author mentioned that Lewis and Clark, they ran out of booze, and it just wasn't talked about that much for some reason. It's like nobody wants to discuss whiskey. It was like this four-letter word, and then you begin to realize that the first thing, and everyone would say when they were discussing the history of Pacific Northwest, they would say the first thing built was the saloon, the
Yep.
school, the church. I mean,
Yep.
those were the three things that were built, and the tent saloon. That picture of that got that from the Yukon Territory because I couldn't find one in Washington State, but that's what they looked like. This was
Yeah.
not a nice little. This wasn't even a dive bar. The saloons, the way Hollywood is depicted a saloon is a walking joke. It was more R-rated, NC-17, possibly even X, depending on where you went.
I love it. I love it. So, um, let's talk about. Hold on. Yes. I have a page marked here. Prohibition in the wet Washington state. Let's talk about how that whole situation was going down.
Well, Washington and Oregon, being the kind of rocket states that they were, ended up having more laws and more regulations against them. They were really fighting against, and this is a good example of how you really should look at your local ordinances before you vote. A lot of people want to get rid of the saloon. The saloon was god awful. I mean, to put it mildly, people get mad at Carrie Nation. They make fun of her. They don't realize she was getting drunks out of there at 8 a.m. People were drinking 24/7. They weren't going home to their wives. Their paycheck wasn't going home to the family. They would send their child over to the saloon to pick up a gallon of beer, and the kids would end up seeing things that no child should ever see.
Right.
This was a situation so raucous. I described how in a saloon in Spokane, a circus monkey got caught loose, and they didn't discover the monkey was loose until a year later when they did renovations. That gives
Wow.
you an idea of like these were not. Now, if you had money, if you were of means, they would have the private club set up, just like they always did in the East Coast for those of the Ivy League sorts, had their own private drinking. I'm talking about how the rest of us drank. If you had enough money, you were isolated, you had your imported brandies, liquor, wine, and spirits from San Francisco, then Portland, then Seattle. But that was for the 1%. Back then, most people, you kind of just did what you could do. And I think, and also here, the saloon operators in many ways were the early blenders, as were the first fur traders. Because think about it, you get this barrel out there. Now, what do? You have it's DIY. There is no other way to make it. So a lot of the initial distillers were bartenders picking up these guides of how do you fake this stuff. This is well before Prohibition. Okay, I can put in some tobacco. I can put in some red sagebush. I can put in certain things to make this look like whiskey, because we're all forgetting that the Taft decision that basically said this is what whiskey is didn't come about till the turn of the century. We didn't have barreled and bond until the turn of the century, and we didn't have the Food and Drug Act until 1906. So this was definitely, in terms of what went into the whiskey, depending on whoever your bartender was, you had to trust your bartender. And cuts were generally not that much of a deal. You didn't have much whiskey. So are you really going to cut that whiskey and get rid of it when you have, no other whiskey that you're making at home?
Right.
So cuts were kind of almost non-existent. And in the case of whiskey sold to the natives, that's where they would actually add the poison and other elements that were just, that was one of the most devastating things in the book, is just realizing the extent to
Yeah.
which whiskey was used to totally decimate a population of people for no other reason than just abject cruelty and because they could.
Let's talk about the legislation of liquor in the Washington territory, and how that all started to be.
Well, the initially attempts to ban liquor were not successful. The only thing they were successful at doing initially was to have laws against allowing the natives. And sometimes, believe it or not, that was instituted by the local tribe. For example, the first distillery in Washington State was at Fort Vancouver. It lasted 3 years. The local tribe leaders came and said, please get rid of it. They didn't like the effect it was having on the local natives. So, and what people were discovering, the stark, dirty secret, and this applies to distilling, is that they could, if you gave a native some whiskey, he could go off and capture the furs for you, and you would then sell them. So people became, I don't want to say lazy, but this was a very dangerous job. They discovered that if I just gave this guy some whiskey, and he will go and do this incredibly dangerous job for me, and I won't get killed.
Right.
So that was, I think we have to realize that this is kind of how the culture was going into. Every time they would do an attempt to try to ban liquor, forget it, forget it, forget it. Finally, women in Washington state got the right to vote in 1910. This was the year they decided to vote a local option in, where people could decide, do you want liquor, do you not want liquor? 42% of the state went dry.
Wow.
And then by 1916, the entire state went dry. This is 4 years before national prohibition.
Wow.
When we say it went dry, it went as dry as the local officials wanted it to be. The people in the rural areas were much more in favor of prohibition than the people in the big cities. And
Interesting.
some of that was just also practical, because you didn't know if your farmhand went to the city, you didn't know what kind of shape he was going to come back in, if he was
Mhm.
going to come back.
Right.
So the railroad workers, there became a huge problem with intoxication on jobs that required the use of machinery. You can't have a farmhand, someone working the railroad, working the sawmill. These people can't be working highly intoxicated.
Yeah.
So that was some of the concern. You also had certain, immigrant population would come over. The Germans, the Italians, the Irish, they brought with them their traditions of beer or whiskey and wine. The other traditions brought with them their religious traditions. So you'd have the Scandinavians. They might make the aquavit for their parties, but they were generally teetotalers. So certain areas of the state were more enforcing it than others. The big cities, by and large, did not enforce it. It was about as wet as it could be. It didn't get the press that we want because we didn't have a John Dillinger. We didn't have an Al Capone out here. We didn't have. We had gentlemen bootleggers. It was very. We had a gentleman bootleggers convention here. We had
Convention.
Boeing. Boeing here, where they could access Al Hubbard, who was Roy Olmsted's engineer. They were selling. I don't know why they would do this, but they were selling World War II airplane parts.
Oh
And so
wow.
Al Hubbard bought some of them, put them in his speedboats, and he could outspeed the Coast Guard. And that was one way that they got them through. I discovered 4 instances of pilots, people that were using. This is a very newfangled technology. There were no formal FAA airstrips. There was just, we think about it, crop dusting didn't happen until 1927. Lindbergh's flight was, no, sorry, crop dusting was 24. Lindbergh's flight was 27. So when you think of this is a whole new thing. So I found the first person I think this covered this four accounts of different pilots and operations. They were flying into Canada and flying back. So there was rum-rumming up and down Puget Sound, outweighing the Coast Guard. A lot of help from Canada. Brad Holden has done a very good job of explaining a lot of this in his book, Seattle Prohibition, how, the Canadian government was like, hey, this is great for us. I mean, look at how many Canadian brands got started as a result of Prohibition. I mean, Seagram's out in Chicago. They were furnishing all of Al Capone and that whole Midwestern area. So you look at who emerged as the major players, and a lot of these big brands, that's where they got started, with Prohibition.
Don't touch that device. We'll be right back with more from Becky Garrison.
There's nothing better than the smell of coffee in the morning. What if you could enjoy a coffee subscription of fresh, roasted specialty coffee while making a difference in the lives of the farmers that grow it? What if you also had access to a virtual coffee community of other coffee lovers and the coffee farmer and roaster? That's all part of the Farm to Cup Coffee Club subscription at Unleashed Coffee. Subscribe today. UnleashedCoffee.com.
Let's talk about, since we're on kind of illegal stuff, home distilling remaining illegal, and how did it become illegal? When did it become illegal?
Home distilling has never been legal in the United States, technically. I mean, if you look at it from a perspective, the question was it deemed illegal and enforceable, or did they not want to? But you've always needed, supposedly, I mean, when you go back to colonial times, it can be different, because in colonial times, you had largely women they were making the beer, distilling the cider, distilling the grains. We had no pasteurization. And what did you do with your excesses grains? It was much easier to distill it. Then as we got into more of the commercial distilleries, that's when you began to find raids here and there. And I think a lot of those raids, it depended, if you looked at it, depended on what did local law enforcement care about? Who was going to get upset over this particular, case? Because some law enforcement, they didn't care. They might have been making it themselves. So you look at how raids happen. And in fact, the first time we tried to tax whiskey, you saw how the whiskey rebellion went.
Oh, yeah.
Americans are not into having their spirits taxed. They are not. And that's, I think, one of the things we have to kind of think about is where, I mean, people have said to me, how do you want to compare Prohibition? Is that Prohibition was another example where you had the officials were doing the exact same thing. They were basically sending people to jail for doing the exact same thing they were doing.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So then let's talk about, now that, once everything became legal again, like after Prohibition, let's talk about the craft movement and how things started back up in Washington, and the rise of the single malt.
Well, we ended Washington State, as you know, every state after Prohibition kind of set up what they wanted to do as far as their own system. And Washington State system ended up being among the highest taxed and most highly regulated of any state in the nation. It was absolutely, very restrictive what you could do. It was almost kind of like, you almost felt like you're kind of doing something illegal. You're going behind this bar and you're asking for this little purse, this little post office kind of thing, and you feel like, oh my God, this is kind of dirty to, buy things. And in fact, the Washington State it's Washington even got into the booze business where they were actually bottling whiskey for a while. Washington and Oregon purchased a fair amount of whiskey from a distiller in Scotland, and they were distributing this in bulk, and that was their way to try to prevent illegal distilling. But the taxes were still so high, and also, it wasn't always all bad things. I mean, you did have some really high quality farmers who were making a really high quality brandy, and one farmer was saying, "I can make $5 back in 1933 for my brandy. Why should I get licensed and pay for all this? I'm doing a very good hand to mouth." You always had a few people like that doing that kind of hand to mouth, but there was a lot of illicit distilling. A lot of work with the roadhouses. There was just a lot of liquor was kind of going around. So no matter how much the Washington State Liquor Control Board tried to control the liquor, it just was not flowing. Finally, I think in 2007, Don and his friend Keith of Dry Fly decided to work with the Washington State Legislature to change it. So they opened up their own distilling. Then they changed the craft law where instead of paying several $1,000s, someone could pay in the hundreds of dollars. The products had to be made with 51% Washington State, grown products. And that launched the beginning of a movement where from 2007, we had one distillery. By 2012, they had 20.
Right.
We now have, we think, about 75. There was 135 licenses on file, but a number of those, we don't know quite the status because, distilling license goes for 10 years.
Right.
There's a lot of licenses out there taken out in 2019 that have not been redeemed. And time will tell what people are going to do with these. They may not open, but so Washington State has now grown to be number 3 or number 4. It's either us or Texas for number of distilleries. And I suspect that Texas probably has more because they're looking at the total number of distillery licenses, not number of active distilleries. And those numbers continue to get flexible. I just heard of another person telling me today, my distillery is closing. So people continue to move in and out of this industry very quickly. And with this, I think, comes to me the most exciting development here is because you've had Matt Hoffman on your show and talking about the rise of American single malt. This is going to be, in my view, the epicenter of where the really, no offense to anybody else, they make all great American single malts, but I just think we are in a position where we are going to be doing some incredibly off the wall stuff and off the charts stuff with American single malts. There's just these guys are like the beer pioneers. They're coming from a beer background. They're doing really interesting stuff with the malt houses. They're starting to connect with farmers locally to buy directly from the farmer.
Right.
A lot of interesting changing methods like this. Like Jason Parker is now starting to contract where I will pay you per acre to grow this certain kind of barley instead of growing per bushel. And that's going to produce much better grades because the farmer's like, if I'm going to get the same money, I'll plant your Alba, even though it's a less higher yield than what this malt house said. I'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
You pay me.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of, and it's good for the soil too, to regenerate with, new stuff. So hopefully, these things will continue. And it's also serendipitous that you guys contacted me because this season we started out in Washington and I visited Chambers Bay and Old Soldier and Doc Swinson's. So we've been doing a whole, I don't know, the universe just said, we got to get Becky on the show because it's a Washington kind of feel these days. So what else do you want the readers to know about the book before we let you go?
Well, I think one thing to think about is the Washington Distillers Guild took an unfortunate leave of absence during COVID. And this book, believe it or not, has the most comprehensive listing of distilleries in Washington State.
Great.
Eventually, it will be updated for the website, but for right now, this is the most comprehensive distillery. And I also think it's important to look at the stories. When I first started this, I noticed how all these other distillery books were full of facts. And I said, well, facts are boring. I mean, I want to know the stories. And to me, that's the real truth. And I found that the best story, when I was interviewing distillers, some of them would just give me facts. Here's what I make, blah, blah, blah. other people would give me this great story. When I was a kid, I had to, get the kitchen down. Look at how many distillers came from Prohibition backgrounds. I
Yeah.
had two distillers whose one of them were doctors who had his parents were doctors who made gin during Prohibition, and they sold it as medicinal spirits. And another one had his grandparents ran a bakery that was actually a distillery in their
Oh, wow.
house. And so you begin to discover all these. This is a
A
very
secret
interesting.
bakery distillery. That would be fantastic to go visit.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, until it blew up because one of the still.
That
Well,
sounds likely.
yes, it was. So I think you start looking at the stories. It's very fascinating, and it's also where we have room for growth. Washington State is the first state that has the first distillery on tribal lands in the
Yes.
country. That's a
Yes.
very big. That
We
said,
talked to Justin and Jennifer, the guys behind getting that law turned over
yeah,
on the show too. So
so I
it's
think
great.
but in spite of that, I still could not do a chapter on women in distilling, and I could not do a chapter on people of color in distilling because I had one distillery, which I've already profiled, and there just weren't enough female distillers. We only had less than I can count them all on one hand. So I think
Yeah.
but it's also a very dynamic group. I think also with Washington Distilling, what you notice is if somebody tries to act uppity, they're kind of called out on the carpet here. I mean, we just don't. I mean, I love the fact that other people, like, I'm going to go to Seattle Carnival of Cocktails tomorrow. They have Seattle Cocktail Week has this event, and you'll see everything from Jack Daniels to really high end, delicious spirits. And they're just the way we push flavor over consistency and yield. It is such a huge. It's a natural progression, where people here are accustomed to paying. If you come here you can come to a distillery. Every time you come for a tasting room, you're going to get a different flight. And you go to other places, and sometimes you want that consistency. You want your Lagavulin to taste the same every way. If that's what you want, then there's plenty of places you can go for that. But if you want to just have your taste buds have like an absolute orgasm here, it's absolutely delicious. I mean, every time I come up here, it's like I want to go to the same tasting room, and people are like, "Why do you want to go to the same one?" It's going to be different.
It's going to be different every time. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. All right, Becky, why don't you tell our audience where they can find the book and what the suggested retail price is?
The retail price is $24.99. I do not know if anyone will be discounting it. It's available at the publisher's website, Arcadia Publishing, Amazon, all online outlets, and a sizable number of books our stores are carrying it, along with Bookshop, which what I understand is how independent bookstores can order books.
Fantastic. And then also, do you have it in a Kindle or Apple
The
ebook
the
version?
ebook version will be coming out. I understand that comes out a little bit after the hardcover, but there will be an e-cover because of the nature of the photographs and whatnot. There's no point in doing an audiobook because you really need to look at the
Right.
photos.
There are a lot of great photos in here. Like here's a couple of dudes.
Yep, that's a good old bootlegger.
Yeah, they look like bootleggers. I mean, and then we've got some stuff here with this, just all these great images. You've captured so many wonderful things in here. You have labels, you have images of bootleggers, you have images of old distilleries, new distilleries, old bars, new bars, the dog in the warehouse. I mean, the
Yes,
whole.
yeah. You had to do a distillery dog.
Oh, and before we go, can you tell us a little bit about the bottle on the cover?
That photo was taken by Keith Barnes of Bainbridge Organic Distillers, who's an absolutely delightful person. That is from a liquor bottle from 1910 of the Bohemian Liquor House in Seattle. It was one of those bars. I said it was very common for a bar to also be a bartender. This place went the extra mile of getting a license where they could actually do this.
Nice.
And the place is still in existence as a nightclub somewhere in Seattle, in downtown Seattle, but obviously the place had to close during Prohibition.
Okay. Well, Becky, it's a fascinating book. I love all the stories inside. It's a very good read, and it's not too long. It's, what is this, 164 pages before the bibliography. So it's a great read, guys. And if you're interested in history and you're interested in the West and you're interested in whiskey, then go out and get the book today. And we will put a link to the Amazon on our website. So thank you so much, Becky. And
You're welcome.
we hope to hear more about, are you going to do a second book on this, or is there other things coming down the pipeline?
There's going to be some other things down the pipeline. I'm looking into wanting to do some more explorations with Jason Parker and Charles Finkel. There's some interesting collaborations between the marriage between beer and whiskey. I just want to follow that. I've also been tracking Oregon's biodynamic wineries.
Oh, fantastic.
We have 1% of the state's wines come from Oregon, but 52% of the biodynamic wineries. So there's a lot of really interesting regenerative farming practices here. And you really start to talk to the farmers, and a push away from GMO into really good stuff. And I just think there's a lot that I think that we can learn from looking at how they farm out here. It's really an attention to the land, growing what works on the land, not trying to over manipulate it, force it to grow something it can't grow. And it's just really exciting time to be, I think, in the Pacific Northwest. And hopefully the TTB will get off their butts soon so we can have this lovely category.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
Well, thank you again for being on the show. Everybody go ahead and get this book. And Becky, we will catch up with you in the future to see more about what you're covering.
Okay, thank you so much.
Distilled in Washington comes out Monday, March 18th. Get 20% off your copy from the publisher by using discount code BarrelRoom at the checkout. The direct link to the book can be found in today's show notes. Coming up on Barrel Room Chronicles, we start a 3-part on-location tour of Washington State with returning guest Jesse Parker from Doc Swinson's on the next Barrel Room Chronicles. That does it for today's show. To read notes on this episode or learn more about our guests, please visit barrelroomchronicles.com. Want to interact with the show or have questions for our guests? Then ask them on our socials or send us an email. Or better yet, leave us a voicemail on our website. If you like what you heard, please rate and subscribe to the podcast. If you really liked it and you want to show your support, buy us a whiskey through our Ko-fi site at ko-fi.com/BRC or become an exclusive member of the Barrel Room Parlor. If you work in the whiskey or spirits industry or just have a deep passion for whiskey and want to share your spirits journey, register to be a guest through our website. Last but not least, please enjoy your spirits responsibly. Thanks for joining me. Until next time, Salangeva.
Barrel Room Chronicles is a production of First Reel Entertainment and is available on Spotify, Apple, Google, iHeartRadio, Amazon, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.